Well, we ended the last half of the show. We sort of touched on education. I know from your point of view, Ronald, you were talking about education from a planner perspective. Let's move a little bit to the consumer. In fact, before I get to that, I just want to ask from your point of view, Noluntu, when it comes to your experiences from complaints and resolutions, is education in the planner's eyes something that they should be looking at from an individual perspective?
Well, Shaun, we start with the legislation. In terms of Section 32 of the FAIS Act, the function of educating consumers resides with the FSP. But we've found that in the process of resolving complaints, it's inherent that we will educate people, not just about which forum to direct the complaint to, but in the effort of persuading the FSP on the one side and the consumer on the other hand to say, well, this is the law, this is how we interpret the law, this is what therefore is expected of you, and this is what you ought to have known. That's education that's going on there.
But from a planner's perspective as well, I mean, are you seeing, and I know we spoke about it a while ago, that when we have a look at advice and sometimes where bad advice was given, is it sometimes the case that that individual or planner just didn't know any better?
Well, there are cases which are blatantly clear. For example, within the realm of property syndication businesses, which has just taken over in terms of the flow of complaints that come into our office, we have often found that the providers don't really know what they're selling. And I think we've said it over and over again in the determinations we've issued. If you don't know how it works, if you don't understand the product, stay away from it.
Okay, well, we've opened that can, Wendy. Property syndications, let's talk it in the scope of education.
Well, I think a lot of people, even advisors, don't understand the product that they're getting. If you have something like an unlisted share or the debenture, which is a property syndication, and at the end of the day, advice is given on that specific property syndication, and you tell your client that they're guaranteed, for instance, income, that's incorrect. Because an unlisted share is very risky, it's high risk. In terms of the disclosure requirements that you must make, you actually need to explain to your client specifically what you're getting into. And as Noluntu has said, unfortunately, some financial service providers don't understand the specific products that they advise their clients on. And that would lead to you giving the incorrect advice, perhaps, to your client, because you are drawing a conclusion and making a recommendation on something that you don't understand. So it's very important that as clients, you make sure that whatever your financial service provider can give you advice on, that they understand it, that you prompt, that you ask more questions about specifically what is the features of this product. And just, you know, do your own bit of research as well if you're not sure whether or not a product is risky or not risky. Some products are safe. Like I say, some products is prudentially regulated. So there's, from the financial service board's point of view, for instance, collective investment schemes, we look at them, we make sure that they comply with specific requirements. And others, like an unlisted share in property syndications, is not regulated on that level. And as such, when you give your money to that specific company, they can do with that money whatever they want to do. So as an advisor, you need to understand that principle and make sure that your client does have the appetite for taking that high risk when investing.
Okay, so I mean the question of regulation really comes to say, well, first check is it regulated? If not, it doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, but one has to then just sort of delve a little bit deeper in terms of understanding the animal that lies behind that. Ronald, you're smiling at me, I'm not too sure why, but I think, I mean, really what we're looking at here as well is that from an education perspective, surely it's the role of the planner to sit down and make sure that somebody understands the full extent of what it is they're purchasing or getting themselves involved in.
I think that is one of the most important things that's come out of recent FAIS Ombudsman decisions, in that the question that's always asked is, did the consumer make an informed decision? And that means that the financial planner needs to talk to the client in a language that the client himself or the consumer understands. I've seen many a time where terminology are used that I think the financial planner probably himself isn't even exactly certain what it means, and the consumer doesn't understand anything that happens. The consumer needs to also be aware of the questions to ask. I believe that most of the schemes that go wrong can be picked up by looking at what are they promising. is that they are promising different from what the average market is offering out there? Because that's normally, in a market that's so highly competitive such as South Africa's, if somebody is standing out with better than expected, I know of a financial product currently that's guaranteeing 20% per annum. Now, I mean, with interest rates at 5.5%, 6%, one should ask yourself, but what am I getting into here? And those questions need to be asked to the financial planner, who, as we've said, from FAIS decisions, need to inform the client correctly about all of these aspects.
Again, it comes down to that sort of normal gut feel of risk versus return. Let's talk about, I mean, a 20% type return or whatever, but when we look at the investment space, I mean, what are the types of complaints that are coming through, and what are the types of sort of responses that you're able to put out there?
Well, Shaun, as I mentioned earlier on, it looks like the property syndications are just taking over that space. That doesn't mean things don't go wrong within the formal sector of investments. Things do still go wrong. But nowadays, we just seeing property syndications all the time. One of the things I wanted to mention with regard to property syndications is that it is very hard to believe that any sort of education from the planner to the consumer ever takes place, because just judging by the paperwork that normally comes in with these complaints, it is telling. I mean, there's so many things that cannot be resolved. One of the things that we spoke about now, Ronald mentioned, 20% return. You've got to ask yourself, as a planner, number one, what sort of economic activity is going on there to be able to put out to the world this kind of undertaking? For a consumer, probably that question might not arise, but it is up to the planner to educate the consumer. That's number one. Number two, we generally find that there's promises of, for example, the property involved here has been listed out to X number of tenants. This is the amount of rental that's guaranteed. Very little is said about the cost element of running the syndication business itself. It's one thing to say I'm going to collect 5 million rand per month. What attendant expenses need to be deducted from that amount, and what ultimately is going to make up the component that's got to be distributed to the consumers as returns? I don't think anybody ever gets involved in that sort of exercise.
Sure. They just see the number on the top line and it looks like a great deal.
Absolutely.
The one thing I wanted to test just really as well, and I'd like some input from Ronald and Wendy, is when we have a look at a lot of the determinations that have come out in the past, is when pensioners or any investor really has been invested perhaps more aggressively than they would have felt comfortable with. Now, we've seen a lot of determinations come through like that. Is there not a danger that we may be encouraging the industry and the planners to over-conservatism?
Well, we start by saying the FAIS Act prevents us from looking into any complaint that's got to do with investment performance. So if it's investment performance, no matter in what form, we will not entertain. But when it comes to the elderly, for example, there's collateral issues that we can inquire into. How did we get there? What measures were put into place to prevent this kind of result? Did you do a risk profiling, for example? What questions did the planner pose to the retiree client, for example? What sort of chances does this person have of accessing capital again? We come across instances where people have invested their only reserve into something like a property syndication, for example. When a client says, I've lost my 1 million rand, this was the only thing that I've had. I've worked all my life for this money. We've got to ask questions there. We can't say, oh, well, sorry, it didn't go right. Had it gone well, you would be smiling. We need some answers from the planners, and half the time those questions are never answered.
I think what's important as well is, and it goes to the risk profiling. In financial planning, yes, you need to understand risk and you need to understand what's the risk for your clients. But we do find in a lot of cases that people do standard risk profiling without really interpreting, asking the client more questions about testing whether or not that risk profile that they take the client into is correct. Or sometimes just disregarding risk profiling. So as a client, you need to be aware that if you are conservative that a type of investment that the planner is putting you into is conservative, understanding that. And I think that's where the consumer education comes in. Your planner needs to explain to you the product, that you can draw some sort of conclusion whether or not you are prepared to take the risks that comes out of it. For instance, a property syndication, if you're conservative, you shouldn't be putting all your clients' funds into that specific product.
Yeah. Quickly summing up property syndications, not regulated. Does it fall outside of the ambit of FSB and what it is that you try and do?
It doesn't. It's the product itself is not regulated. But if you give financial advice on it, or you render intermediary service and assist your client into obtaining such a unlisted share, then that part is regulated.
Okay. Ronald, from your point of view, I mean, risk profile, it seems very neat and tidy. Is it doing the job that it needs to?
No, it's not.
Okay.
If you think that risk profiling, as the FAIS Act requires it, is filling in 10, 20 questions and then putting everything that you have in, let's say, a moderate basket, then you're missing the point. That's nothing more than pigeonholing and probably a way from the financial planner to say, sorry, it's not my advice, it was you that decided to be moderate, and it's your funds. That was never the intention of taking risk profiling into account. Coming back to a point that you've said also is that we are seriously afraid that consumers in South Africa are becoming aggressively conservative. And actually recklessly conservative. And that is going to hurt them going forward. One needs to remember that the only risk out there is not just market risk. You've got the risk that you are going to live too long. You've got the risk that your money will not be able to sustain your whole life. You've got a number of other risks that also exist out there. And a proper financial planner should take all those risks into consideration. And as Wendy said, it's filling in that risk profile, but also asking those other questions, making sure that the needs of the consumer is
okay. So it does come down to the needs of the consumer.
It comes
at
down
the end
to
of the day,
needs.
it cannot be a tick box approach. If it comes to your sort of office, then I mean it's going to be looked at outside of the scope of just saying, did I tick the box in the right area and what have you. We're almost out of time, but Noluntu, from your side, really I want to ask your thoughts and guidelines to clients. What should they be looking out for in 10 seconds?
All right, let's start with the issue of the tick box. We call it paying lip service to the FAIS Act. There's no way one is going to be able to uncover the necessary and important details about a risk pertaining to a particular client and risk pertaining to the product by just applying that tick box approach.
Okay, so it goes outside of that. I'm going to have to cut you off there. I'm sure there's probably another whole show that we could talk about this. At the end of the day, it's good to see that we have got rights and recourse for the consumer, provided they know where to go, and hopefully by now they should have some idea of what it is that the FPI, the FAIS Ombud, and the Financial Services Board are doing for